In the mountains of Europe, a small castle was rising in silence. No one knew this castle would one day change the fate of Europe. The name of this family would become Habsburg. And for centuries, kings, emperors, and armies would live beneath their shadow. At the center of Europe stood the Holy Roman Empire. But this was not a single unified state. Hundreds of duchies, kingdoms, and princes were fighting for power. And the Habsburgs were searching for a way to rise within this chaos. In 1273, a decision was made that would change the balance of Europe. Rudolf of Habsburg was elected king of the Romans. Many nobles never expected him to rise this far. But in that moment, the true rise of the Habsburgs had begun. But standing before Rudolf was still a great obstacle. King Ottokar II of Bohemia was one of the most powerful rulers in Central Europe. In 1278, the two armies met on the plains of Marchfeld. When the battle ended, Ottokar was dead, and the Habsburgs had gained Austria. With Ottokar's death, the balance of power in Central Europe began to change. Austria had now become the center of the Habsburg dynasty. The dynasty understood not only war, but also how to grow patiently. And soon, marriages would become more powerful than swords. The Habsburgs had chosen a different path. They wanted to grow without constant war. One marriage was followed by another, and the dynasty began spreading across Europe. While rival dynasties weakened through wars, the Habsburgs gained strength through alliances. And a new reality was emerging in Europe. The Habsburgs were becoming unstoppable. In the 15th century, a leader appeared who would change the fate of the Habsburgs. Maximilian's marriage to Mary of Burgundy changed the balance of power in Europe. Because with this marriage, Europe's richest cities passed to the Habsburgs. And France now saw the rising Habsburg power as a threat. One of the greatest moves of the Habsburgs would be their marriage alliance with Spain. Because Joanna's family were the most powerful rulers of Spain. After this marriage, Habsburg power began extending beyond Europe. And soon, one of the most powerful rulers Europe had ever seen would emerge. His name was Charles V. Charles V inherited one of the greatest empires Europe had ever seen. Gold and silver from the New World were filling the Habsburg inns. And across Europe, everyone was asking the same question. Who could stop the Habsburgs? In 1517, an event occurred that would change Europe forever. Martin Luther was challenging the Catholic Church. Europe was now dividing in two, Catholics and Protestants. For Charles V, the struggle was no longer only about territory. At the same time, from the east, another superpower was rising. And at the head of this empire stood Suleiman the Magnificent. The Battle of Mohacs in Yiwu Harliu changed the fate of Central Europe. Now, the Ottomans had reached the borders of the Habsburgs. In 1529, the Ottoman army reached Vienna. Europe was terrified because Vienna could fall. For days, deadly fighting raged across the city walls. And in the end, the Ottoman army withdrew. But even after Vienna, the war did not end. Hungary and the Balkans had become the battleground of two empires. For years, both sides tried to wear each other down. And the fate of Europe was being shaped by the struggle between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. In 1683, the Ottoman army once again arrived before Vienna. In 1683, the Ottoman army once again arrived before Vienna. At the final moment, the arriving European armies changed the fate of the siege. With this defeat, the Ottoman advance into Europe began to slow. After Vienna, the balance of power began to change. The Habsburgs were no longer only defending, they were becoming one of Europe's greatest dynasties. Kings and ambassadors were now recognizing the power of the Habsburg court. But before the dynasty, even greater storms still awaited. In the 17th century, Europe was dragged into a new catastrophe. Catholics and Protestants had declared war on one another. Cities were collapsing, and millions were losing their lives. And the Habsburgs stood at the center of the war, shaking Europe. Across Europe's royal courts, the Habsburg name now meant power and fear. They had built an empire not only through war, but also through marriage and diplomacy. But like every great empire, the rise of the Habsburgs would not last forever. After centuries of dominance, the dynasty slowly began to weaken. New powers like France and Prussia were changing the balance of Europe. Constant dynastic marriages had caused serious genetic problems within the family. Then Europe witnessed the rise of Napoleon. In 1806, the Holy Roman Empire came to an end. A nearly 1,000-year-old empire had collapsed beneath Napoleon's shadow. A story that began in a small mountain fortress had become a dynasty that ruled Europe for centuries.